Have you ever been judged before anyone even knew your story? Imagine stepping onto a plane, ticket in hand, proud of the life you've built, only to be told you don't belong in the very seat you earned. What would you do? Stay silent to keep the peace, or stand up and risk everything just to be seen for who you really are? This is the story of David Carter, a calm, successful black CEO traveling with his teenage daughter. But when a flight attendant assumes he doesn't belong in first class and humiliates them both, the moment spirals into something far greater than anyone could imagine. A moment of quiet dignity becomes a lesson the whole world would soon learn from. Because sometimes, the most powerful response isn't anger, it's grace. And the biggest surprises come when truth finally takes flight. If you were in his place, how would you respond? Stay with us as we uncover a story of prejudice, courage, and redemption at 30,000 feet. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss stories that remind us how powerful respect and empathy can be. The morning light spilled across the wide windows of San Francisco International Airport. It was just another travel day, planes humming, announcements echoing, families rushing toward gates with coffee cups and suitcases rolling behind them. To everyone else, it looked ordinary. But for David Carter, it was something different. David was a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his early 50s. He wore a navy blue jacket, plain white shirt, and no tie, the kind of look that spoke more of calm than of power. Next to him walked Maya, his 17-year-old daughter, holding a book and glancing around with quiet excitement. It was the first time she would travel with her father in the first-class cabin. They moved through the terminal quietly. People glanced, then looked away, some curious, some uncertain. David noticed every look, though his face didn't show it. He had seen those looks his whole life. But today, he had no intention of reacting. He wanted to observe. "Dad," Maya whispered, "why are people staring at us like that?" "Because," he said softly, "some folks still judge before they know. Let them." "But doesn't it bother you?" "It used to. Not anymore. You'll learn peace is a louder statement than anger." They reached Gate 22B, where the digital board glowed with their flight number, Orion Air Flight OA237, bound for New York City. David's eyes paused for a moment on the Orion logo, a silver star inside a blue circle. He smiled faintly. That logo meant more to him than anyone around could guess. He was the man who had saved the airline from bankruptcy 6 months ago. He was its new owner, but nobody knew. Not yet. He wanted to experience what his passengers experienced without the title, without the power. When the boarding announcement began, they stepped forward with other first-class passengers. The woman at the gate counter scanned their tickets. For a split second, her expression froze, a flicker of confusion, quickly replaced by a polite smile. "Welcome aboard," she said. But the tone carried something else, surprise that didn't quite hide behind courtesy. Inside the cabin, the air smelled faintly of leather and citrus. Soft jazz played through overhead speakers. Rows of wide cream-colored seats gleamed under soft light. Maya's eyes widened. "This is beautiful," she whispered. David smiled. "Yes, it is. Let's see if it feels as good as it looks." They sat near the front window. Across the aisle, a man in a gray suit lifted his eyebrows when he saw them. He gave a short, polite nod, then looked away with the kind of indifference that always said more than words. A flight attendant walked by, tall, blonde, her uniform perfectly pressed, her badge reading Rebecca Sloan. She smiled at the man in the gray suit. Then she passed David and Maya without a glance. A moment later, She returned, carrying glasses of orange juice on a tray. She stopped at every seat except theirs. Maya watched quietly, her fingers curling on her armrest. David noticed, but he said nothing. He leaned back, opened a magazine, and waited. He'd learned long ago that silence had weight, and sometimes that weight made people reveal themselves. After a few minutes, Rebecca returned again, this time carrying 2 small plastic cups. "Here you go," she said quickly, placing them down. Her tone was neutral, her smile tight. Everyone else had glassware. Only theirs was plastic. Maya looked at the cups, then at her father. Dad. David met her eyes, still calm. "It's all right. Keep watching." A few seats ahead, 2 businessmen whispered something and chuckled. David heard them, though he pretended not to. He turned his head toward the window, watching the ground crew load luggage. He could almost hear the engines breathing that familiar rhythm that used to lull him to sleep when he was still a young engineer, years before success. He remembered those early mornings, the smell of jet fuel, and the supervisor who once told him, "You're smart, Carter, but our clients prefer someone who looks the part." He'd smiled then, too, because anger would have cost him the chance to build something greater. Now, decades later, the same lesson returned, only this time. His daughter was watching. Rebecca came down the aisle again, checking seat numbers. When her eyes landed on David and Maya, she hesitated. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "May I see your tickets again?" David looked up, calm and steady. "You've already scanned them," he said softly. "I know, sir, but there's been an issue with our system. It sometimes upgrades passengers by mistake." Her smile was tight, more warning than courtesy. David handed her the tickets anyway. "Take your time," he said. Maya frowned. "Why does she think we don't belong here?" David's eyes softened. "Because she doesn't see us yet. She only sees what she expects." He leaned closer. "People fear what doesn't fit their picture of comfort. The trick is, you don't let their fear define your peace." Rebecca walked away with the tickets, whispering something to another attendant near the galley. A few heads turned subtly toward them. David noticed the shift, that quiet murmur that spreads when people smell tension but pretend not to. Maya crossed her arms, angry now. "Dad, this isn't fair." "No, it isn't," he said. "But fairness doesn't always arrive on time. Sometimes it needs an invitation." Outside the window, the first rays of sunlight painted the runway gold. The captain's voice came over the speaker, smooth and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Orion Air Flight 237 to New York. We'll be departing shortly." Maya looked out at the horizon, her reflection trembling faintly on the glass. She wanted to say something more, but she felt the lump in her throat, that quiet pain of being doubted for reasons you can't change. David rested his hand gently on hers. "Remember this moment," he whispered. "One day, you'll understand why I didn't fight. Not yet." The seatbelt sign blinked. Engines roared softly beneath their feet. Rebecca returned, her voice clipped. "Sir, I'm still waiting for confirmation from the front desk. Until then, please remain seated." David nodded. "Serene. Of course. We're not in a hurry. But inside," he was thinking not of anger, but of responsibility. He had built this airline to represent something better. And if this was happening here, then the problem was deeper than he thought. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Maya leaned her head on his shoulder. "Dad," she murmured, "I wish people would just see us." He smiled, eyes fixed on the sunrise. "They will, sweetheart," he said. "Eventually. Everyone sees the truth, even when it takes the sky to show it. The engines thundered louder. The plane lifted off, climbing through clouds that glowed pink and orange. Inside the cabin, the world looked peaceful again, but underneath that calm, something had already begun to stir. The aircraft hummed softly as it cut through the clouds. The cabin lights dimmed to a warm glow, casting a golden shimmer across the first-class seats. Maya leaned back, pretending to read, but her eyes wandered toward the aisle where Rebecca moved with mechanical precision. The flight attendant's smile seemed to melt for some passengers and freeze for others. Every gesture she gave carried an unspoken judgment. David sipped from the plastic cup, tasting the faint bitterness of orange juice mixed with silence. He had seen this kind of silence before, the kind that fills the air when people refuse to acknowledge what they see. Around him, polished shoes tapped lightly on the carpet. Designer watches flashed under the cabin light, and laughter from 2 rows ahead sounded rehearsed. When Rebecca reached the front again, she bent down to adjust the blanket for an elderly woman, her tone soft and warm. Then her gaze drifted back toward David's row, and something in her face tightened. She hesitated, then turned away. Maya exhaled, her voice low. "Dad, she's ignoring us again." David didn't look up. Sometimes silence reveals more than words ever could. Maya frowned, flipping her page but not reading. She could feel eyes on them, subtle glances, curious, cautious, almost guilty. One man cleared his throat. Another adjusted his cufflinks, pretending not to stare. Rebecca returned, holding a silver tray. "Would you prefer sparkling water or wine?" "Sir," she asked a passenger across the aisle. The man chuckled. "Make it wine." She poured carefully, laughing along. Then, without turning to David or Maya, she hurried down the aisle toward the galley. David reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed a short note. "Observe service interactions in first class. Track bias cues. Compare to training manual." He locked the screen again. Maya caught the movement. "Are you taking notes, old habits?" he murmured. "Observation builds understanding. Understanding builds change." For a while, there was only the hum of engines and the faint rustle of pages turning. Then, suddenly, Rebecca's voice came through, brighter now. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our breakfast service shortly. Please remain seated as we prepare your trays." The scent of brewed coffee drifted through the air. Maya smiled, despite herself. She loved that smell. But when the carts rolled by, Rebecca stopped once more at every row except theirs. Her assistant followed, serving omelets and pastries, but skipped their seats. Maya's stomach growled quietly. She looked at her father, confused, hurt. "Did we do something wrong?" David shook his head slowly. "We did nothing wrong, but we're teaching something right." His calm voice should have comforted her, but it didn't. There was a lump in her throat, a quiet frustration she couldn't swallow. From behind, a deep voice spoke, hesitant but clear. "Excuse me, miss." It was a passenger, a middle-aged man with silver hair and reading glasses. "You skipped them." He gestured toward David and Maya. "They were here before me." Rebecca froze for a moment, then forced a polite laugh. "Oh, my apologies. Must have been an oversight." She turned, setting down 2 trays in front of them. "Here you go. I hope you enjoy your meal." Her tone carried that same cool-edge apology without sincerity. David met her eyes briefly. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, neither grateful nor angry. Maya stared at her plate, appetite gone. The stranger behind them gave a small nod, as if to say, "I see what's happening." Rebecca moved away quickly, but her assistant, a young woman named Elena, lingered for a moment. She leaned closer, whispering, "I'm sorry about that. Sir, it's been tense today." David smiled faintly. "It's all right, Elena. Thank you for your honesty." She nodded and hurried off. But that small exchange had already changed the air around them. The tension had a witness now. Maya finally whispered, "Why do you let people treat us like that? You could tell her who you are. You could stop this." David folded his napkin carefully. Power used too early only feeds fear. Power used at the right time changes hearts. She frowned, staring at him. "But it's unfair." "Yes," he said. "And that's why we remember. Not to hate, to fix." Hours passed. The cabin settled into quiet again. Outside, clouds moved like soft hills, endless and white. Maya drifted between anger and sadness. David watched her, feeling that ache only a father knows, wanting to shield his child from pain, yet knowing she needed to feel it to understand the world. Suddenly, a man from row 4 leaned over, lowering his voice. "Is everything okay here?" he asked. His name tag read Ethan Brooks, the journalist. He had been watching quietly. David smiled gently. "We're fine. Thank you for asking." Ethan hesitated. "I noticed what's happening. If you ever need a record of it." He lifted his phone slightly. "I've been filming since boarding." Maya's eyes widened. "You recorded it?" Ethan nodded. "People need to see what quiet discrimination looks like. It's not shouting, it's omission. It's small, but it's poison." David looked at him thoughtfully. Sometimes exposure helps, but sometimes the lesson needs silence before it's heard. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding something he couldn't yet explain. Rebecca passed by again, pretending not to notice their conversation. Her shoulders were stiff now, the poise in her step cracking just a little. A little turbulence shook the plane. Maya gripped the armrest, startled. David covered her hand. "Easy," he said softly. "The air just reminds us we're not in control of everything." She smiled faintly, despite herself. "You always have a lesson ready." "That's what happens when you've made mistakes long enough to learn from them," he said, half smiling. When the seatbelt light blinked off, Rebecca returned, voice clipped but formal. "Sir, our system still hasn't confirmed your ticket status. It may have been entered incorrectly. I'll need to verify it again once we land." David looked up calmly. "That's fine. We're patient people." Her lips pressed into a thin line before she walked away. Maya stared after her, furious now. "She's doing this on purpose." "Perhaps," David said, "but purpose reveals truth faster than error." He looked out the window again. The clouds parted, revealing streaks of sunlight slicing through blue sky. "You see that light," he said quietly. "It's soft because it traveled far. Sometimes you have to travel through a lot of darkness before people can see who you really are." Maya followed his gaze. The sunlight reflected in her eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Hours later, as the flight began its descent toward New York, Rebecca made her final pass. Her smile looked tired now, forced. David could sense that she felt his calm more than his words, and that unnerved her. When the plane landed, passengers stood up, collecting their bags. Rebecca avoided eye contact as she thanked everyone for flying Orion Air. When David and Maya reached the front, she said quickly, "Have a pleasant day." David paused for a heartbeat, meeting her eyes. "You too, Ms. Sloan." She blinked, surprised he'd read her name tag. For a second, her professional mask cracked. Then she turned away, muttering another thank you. Maya followed her father down the jet bridge, her chest still tight with unspoken emotion. "Are you really just going to let it go?" "Dad." He smiled gently. "Letting go isn't the same as forgetting. Watch what happens next." As they disappeared into the terminal, Ethan trailed behind them, phone still in his hand, a thoughtful look in his eyes. He whispered to himself, "This story isn't over." The terminal at JFK was alive with noise, a sea of voices and movement. But David Carter walked through it as if he were inside a quiet tunnel. He held his daughter's small carry-on in one hand, her trembling fingers in the other. Maya's silence said more than any outburst could. She had always been outspoken, quick to challenge unfairness. But something about what had just happened on that flight had reached deeper than anger. It had touched her pride. Outside the gate, passengers dispersed quickly. Rebecca Sloan stood by the entrance, performing the polite ritual of smiling farewells. Yet her eyes kept drifting toward David and Maya. Her hands fidgeted, as though her perfectly folded professionalism were beginning to crease. David's calm unnerved her. Most passengers who felt slighted would have complained, shouted, or demanded a supervisor. He had done none of that. He had simply looked at her as though he knew something. She didn't, something she was afraid to ask. Maya stopped near a row of windows overlooking the runway. "Dad, please tell me we're not just leaving it like this," she said quietly. Her tone trembled between hurt and disbelief. "You always tell me to speak up when something's wrong." "I do," David replied. "But sometimes speaking up doesn't mean raising your voice. Sometimes it means choosing the right moment to be heard." Her eyes glistened. "But she humiliated us. She humiliated herself," he corrected softly. "We were just the mirror." Maya turned away, blinking fast. She didn't want him to see the tears, though he already did. Behind them, the journalist Ethan Brooks approached, phone in hand. "Mr. Carter," he said quietly, "I have the footage. Everything from boarding to landing. You can decide what to do with it. I wasn't planning to post it without your consent." David studied him for a moment. Why film it at all? Because people forget the small humiliations. They think discrimination only looks like violence, not politeness. I wanted a record that shows what quiet prejudice feels like. David nodded slowly. "A fair reason. But truth doesn't always need exposure to be powerful. Sometimes it needs reflection." Ethan smiled faintly. "I have a feeling you'll use it better than I could." He handed David his business card, nodded once, and walked away. Maya watched him leave. "He seems decent." "He is," David said. "Most people are decent. Maya, they just get lost between what they were taught and what's right." They started walking toward baggage claim. The air smelled faintly of coffee and jet fuel, that familiar scent of transition. As they moved, a woman's voice called from behind. "Mr. Carter." David turned. It was Elena, the young attendant. She looked nervous, holding her phone like a shield. "Sir, I just wanted to say I'm sorry again for what happened. I wanted to help. But Rebecca's my supervisor. She controls our performance reviews." David smiled gently. "You helped more than you think. Sometimes the smallest kindness shines the brightest in a dark room." Helena exhaled in relief. "Thank you. I hope your trip home goes better." He nodded, and she hurried off, shoulders lighter than before. They reached the luggage carousel. Maya sat on the edge of a bench, tapping her foot, still restless. David placed a hand on her shoulder. "You want justice, don't you?" "I want respect," she answered sharply. "I want people to stop assuming we don't belong." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a start, but respect given out of fear isn't respect at all. We'll handle this the right way." "How?" she asked. He smiled. "You'll see. Later." Outside the terminal, a black car waited. The driver opened the door with a small bow. "Welcome home, Mr. Carter." Rebecca exited the building just in time to see it. She froze when the driver addressed him. Her mind stumbled over the word Mr. Carter. She'd seen that name before, somewhere official. She watched as he stepped into the car, composed as ever, and the door closed with a quiet finality that felt heavier than any confrontation. Inside the car, Maya looked at her father. "You're planning something, aren't you?" David's eyes reflected the city skyline as it rolled past. "No plans, just clarity. I've seen enough to know what needs fixing." That evening, in his Manhattan office overlooking the East River, David sat alone for a long time. He didn't turn on the lights. The city glowed beneath him, endless movement, endless noise. His desk held only a few items: a photo of Maya as a child, a worn leather notebook, and a folder marked Internal Culture Audit Orion Air. He opened the folder. Reports of employee complaints, notes about staff training gaps, and customer surveys filled the pages. Each line carried the same pattern: small issues that pointed to something deeper: unspoken bias, quiet exclusion, subtle disrespect. He had seen it from the inside for months, but today he had lived it again firsthand, beside his daughter. He reached for his phone and made a single call. "Clara," he said, when the line connected, "I need an immediate review of cabin service procedures, and I want to meet with the crew from Flight 237. First thing tomorrow." On the other end, Clara Nguyen, his vice president of operations, hesitated. "Is everything all right?" Sir David's voice stayed calm, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. "No, Clara. But it will be if we do this right." When he ended the call, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled. His reflection in the window looked tired but resolute. He whispered to himself, "It's not enough to build a company that flies high. You have to make sure everyone on board learns how to rise." Meanwhile, across the city, Rebecca Sloan sat alone in her small apartment. The sound of traffic below faded into the hum of her thoughts. She poured herself a glass of wine, but it stayed untouched on the table. She replayed the day over and over: the man's calm eyes, the girl's quiet hurt, the stranger filming. For the first time, she wondered if she had become the kind of person she once pitied. Her phone buzzed with a message from the airline mandatory meeting tomorrow at 9:00 a.m. attendance required for Flight OA237 crew. Rebecca's stomach turned. Something about the tone of that message didn't sound routine. She stared at the screen, anxiety crawling up her spine. She thought of David's parting words. "You two, Ms. Sloan." The way he had said her name, like someone who already knew her story. She didn't sleep much that night. Back at the Carter apartment, Maya stood by her bedroom window, watching the city lights flicker. "Dad," she called softly from across the hall. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think she regrets it?" The flight attendant, David thought for a moment before answering. "Maybe, or maybe she's just beginning to—" Maya turned to face him. "You're not angry?" He smiled gently. "Anger's easy. Understanding takes work, but we'll get there." She nodded, trying to accept that. Yet a part of her still wanted justice to be loud, not patient. The next morning, The sky was pale and heavy with clouds. In the glass meeting room at Orion Air Headquarters, the crew of Flight OA237 gathered. Rebecca sat rigid, trying not to look nervous. Clara Nguyen stood at the front, poised, efficient, unaware of what was about to unfold. Then the door opened, and David Carter walked in. The room fell silent. Every face turned toward him. Some smiled politely. Rebecca's eyes widened, the blood draining from her face. "Good morning," David said evenly. "Thank you for being on time. Let's talk about Flight 237. Clara blinked, confused. "Sir, you mean yesterday's flight?" "Yes," he said. "Yesterday's flight taught me something valuable. It reminded me how far we've come and how far we still need to go." Rebecca's throat tightened. David placed a folder on the table. "Before we begin, I want honesty. No excuses. No blame. Just truth." He met Rebecca's eyes briefly, not with anger, but with quiet weight, the kind of look that strips away defense and leaves only reflection. Rebecca opened her mouth, then closed it. Her practiced composure faltered, and in that silence, heavy, sharp, and human, the reckoning began. The conference room at Orion Air Headquarters gleamed with glass and quiet tension. The skyline of New York stretched endlessly behind David Carter, its early morning fog softening the hard lines of skyscrapers. Inside, the atmosphere was heavier than the air outside. The faint hum of the air conditioner was the only sound until David placed his folder on the polished table. Everyone's eyes followed the motion as though it carried the weight of a verdict. "Let's begin," he said simply. Rebecca Sloan sat 3 seats away, spine straight, fingers interlocked on her lap. The calm voice that had once commanded passengers now trembled with every breath. She knew this wasn't just a staff debrief. She could feel it. This was a reckoning. Clara Nguyen stood beside David, holding her tablet, confusion flickering across her composed face. "Sir," she began carefully, "you mentioned there was an incident on Flight OA237. The report I received said everything went smoothly." David turned his gaze toward her. Not harsh, but deliberate. "That's the problem. Clara, it looked smooth. On paper. There were no complaints. But what happens when people stop complaining because they believe it won't matter?" No one answered. He opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet, a printed image from Ethan Brooks's footage. In it, Rebecca was standing beside the aisle, offering crystal glasses to every passenger except one row. The frame caught David and Maya sitting quietly, plastic cups in front of them. The picture told a story words couldn't. Gas rippled softly through the room. Rebecca's face drained of color. Clara's lips parted slightly in disbelief. David's tone remained even. "Yesterday, my daughter and I boarded a flight. We were treated as though we didn't belong in the seats we paid for. No shouting, no insults, just silence, omission. But make no mistake, silence can wound deeper than words." He looked at Rebecca directly for the first time. "Ms. Sloan, do you remember this moment?" Her throat tightened. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "Tell me what you saw when you looked at us." Rebecca's fingers twisted together. The room held its breath. "I saw passengers who didn't seem." She stopped, searching for the right phrase, but every word sounded wrong. "It was a busy morning. I made assumptions I shouldn't have." "Assumptions," David repeated softly. "That's an honest answer." She swallowed hard. "I didn't mean any harm." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it dangerous. Harm that's unintentional spreads faster because no one thinks they're responsible for it." For a long moment, silence stretched. Maya sat quietly near the door, observing her father in awe. She had begged to attend this meeting, wanting to see how he would face the woman who had humiliated them. She expected anger, but what she saw instead was precision calm, deliberate, almost surgical truth. Clara finally spoke. "Mr. Carter, if I may, we can launch an internal investigation, issue an apology, maybe suspend." David raised a hand slightly, stopping her. "No, punishment won't solve perception. You can't teach empathy through fear." He turned back to the crew. "What we need is understanding, a change that lasts longer than an apology headline." Rebecca lowered her gaze. "I don't expect forgiveness," she murmured. David's voice softened. "Forgiveness isn't the goal, Miss Sloane. Awareness is. You can't fix what you refuse to see." He leaned against the edge of the table, his tone quiet but commanding. "I built this company because I believed the skies should unite people, not divide them. But what I experienced yesterday told me we still have blind spots. We have to retrain not just how we serve, but how we see." He paused, then looked at Clara. "Starting today, I want to implement a full review of our service culture. Every employee, every department, from executives to cabin crew." Clara nodded firmly, already typing notes. "Understood, sir." "Good," David said, "and I'll personally oversee it." Rebecca looked up, startled. "You'll be part of the training." "Yes," he replied, "because leadership isn't just giving orders. It's showing the way through example." The words hit her harder than any reprimand could. After the meeting, people filed out quietly, whispering to each other. Rebecca lingered, hesitating at the door. Maya was still there, standing beside her father. She didn't glare. She didn't smirk. She simply looked at Rebecca with a calmness that felt both kind and unsettling. Rebecca took a step forward. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "I'm truly sorry for what I did to you and your daughter. I know an apology doesn't erase it, but—" David nodded, cutting her off gently. "Don't apologize to me. Show it through what you do next." Her voice wavered. "I'll do better." "Then do," he said, walking past her. Maya followed him out, her steps quiet, her mind racing. "You weren't angry at all, Dad," she said once they were alone in the hallway. "You could have humiliated her the way she did to us." He smiled faintly. "Revenge is loud, change is quiet, and it lasts longer." She looked up at him, uncertain but moved. "You think she'll really change?" "I think she's scared enough to start thinking. Sometimes that's where learning begins." Later that day, Rebecca sat alone in the staff cafeteria, untouched lunch growing cold in front of her. She stared out the window at the tarmac below. Planes rolled slowly across the runway, massive, heavy things that somehow learned to fly. She wondered if people could do the same. Elena approached cautiously, setting down a coffee. Rough morning, Rebecca managed a small smile. "That's an understatement." Elena hesitated. "You know, he didn't have to handle it like that. Most people would have gone to HR or the press." "I know," Rebecca said quietly. "That's what makes it worse. He was kind, and I wasn't." Elena sat beside her. "Maybe that's your chance, then, to fix it from inside." Rebecca looked at her, really looked the younger woman's sincerity, the lack of judgment. For the first time that day, Rebecca felt something other than shame. It was the faintest trace of determination. Meanwhile, in his office upstairs, David watched the city again. Clara entered with her tablet. "The audit plan's ready," she said, "but the media might get wind of what happened. Should we prepare a statement?" David turned toward her. No. If it becomes public, we'll respond with honesty. But I'm not hiding behind PR. We fix it internally first. Clara hesitated. And Rebecca. She'll stay, he said. If we fire every person who makes a mistake, we'll have no one left to learn from. Clara nodded slowly, admiration in her eyes. You're really turning this into a lesson for everyone, aren't you? He smiled faintly. Life gives you two kinds of pain. Clara, the kind that breaks you, and the kind that teaches you. I prefer the second, downstairs. As Rebecca left the building, she stopped at the entrance and looked back once. She didn't know why, but she felt that something had shifted, not just in her career, but in her understanding of what it meant to see others clearly. And somewhere deep inside her shame, a small seed of courage began to grow. Morning light streamed through the large glass panels of Orion Air's lobby, spilling across polished floors where employees moved briskly, unaware of the quiet storm brewing above them. David Carter stood near the window of his top-floor office, his gaze following a plane that was just lifting from the runway at LaGuardia. He watched it climb until it disappeared into the haze, and he thought of the thousands of passengers who would board his aircrafts every day, some welcomed, some tolerated, few truly seen. Behind him, Clara Nguyen entered, holding a folder and a cup of coffee. The internal review has started, she said. I've assigned a cultural assessment team to interview staff from every department. But there's another issue. David turned. Go on. There's chatter online, Clara said, her tone careful. A video clip from Flight 08237 is spreading. It's blurry, but people recognize you. He raised an eyebrow. Ethan Brooks. Clara nodded. He didn't post it directly. Someone leaked it. It's gaining traction. Comments, debates, words like racism, corporate hypocrisy, CEO as victim. The narrative's spinning in all directions. David stayed silent for a long moment. His reflection in the glass looked calm, but his jaw tightened. Let it run, he said finally. We can't control truth, only how we respond to it. Clara hesitated. The board's nervous. Some think we should issue a statement before the press twists it. No, David said. If I speak now, it'll sound defensive. I'll speak when we've done something worth talking about. Downstairs. The same video played silently on a staff member's phone. It spread like wildfire through employee group chats, into newsrooms, across social media. The clip wasn't long. A black man sitting calmly beside his teenage daughter, 2 plastic cups before them, while others around sipped from crystal glasses. The attendant's back was visible, posture stiff. 1,000 strangers added their own interpretations. Some condemned, some doubted, some justified. Rebecca Sloan sat in the crew lounge when she first saw it. Her heart dropped. Her face wasn't clear, but she knew every movement of that scene by memory. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through the comments, people calling for her firing, others defending her, some saying the video proved nothing, each word carved deeper into her guilt. Helena entered quietly, noticing the screen. It's everywhere, she said softly. I'm sorry, Rebecca. Rebecca looked up, eyes red-rimmed. I never meant for this to happen. I made a mistake. But now I'm the face of every ugly thing people hate. Helena sat beside her. Then you show them who you are now, not who you were. Rebecca gave a shaky laugh. And how do I do that? Half the internet wants me gone. The other half wants to forget I exist. Maybe you start by not hiding, Helena said gently. He didn't hide either. That afternoon, David met with his communications director, a brisk woman named Janet Rivers, who looked perpetually 2 steps ahead of every problem. "We can't ignore this," she said, dropping a pile of printed tweets on his desk. "Everyone's waiting for your reaction." Silence looks like guilt. David flipped through the pages, reading the storm of opinions, then looked up. "Sometimes silence looks like listening," he said. "And I'm still listening." Janet frowned. "Listening won't stop a PR crisis." "No," he replied, "but it might stop us from making a moral one." She sighed, rubbing her temple. "Fine, but at least prepare something, in case the board panics." David nodded. "Draft it, but don't release it until I say." That night, in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city, David found Maya sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. The glow from the screen lit her face, a mix of anger and sadness. "They're calling you a liar." "Dad," she said, "some people think you staged it to look noble." David sat beside her, calm as ever. "Public judgment moves faster than truth. That's why we move slower." "But it's not fair," she said, voice shaking. "You're trying to change things, and they're tearing you apart for it." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Fairness isn't promised. Integrity is chosen." She looked at him, eyes wet. "You're not going to defend yourself. I already did," he said softly, "by not becoming what they accuse me of." The next morning, David arrived at headquarters early. Reporters had gathered near the entrance, cameras ready. He walked past them without stopping, his composure so steady it silenced even the boldest question. Inside, employees turned to watch as he passed. Some smiled faintly, others avoided his gaze. He felt the tension but didn't acknowledge it. Change always made people uncomfortable. Upstairs, Clara was waiting. "It's getting worse," she said, voice low. "But something interesting happened. Rebecca came to my office." David looked up from his desk. "She did, yes. She asked to meet with you, not to plead, to talk." He thought for a moment, then nodded. "Schedule it. Tomorrow morning." When Rebecca entered his office the next day, she looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. Her uniform was pressed, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. She stood by the door until David gestured for her to sit. "Thank you for seeing me," she began. "You asked for honesty," he said. "That always deserves time." She took a deep breath. "I've read the comments. The hate. I deserve some of it, maybe all of it. But I need to understand. Why didn't you name me? Why protect me?" David leaned back in his chair. "Because this isn't about you, Rebecca. It's about what you represent. You're one thread in a much larger fabric. Cutting you out doesn't fix the weave." Her voice broke. "I've been thinking about that day nonstop. I keep replaying every second. I wish I could undo it." "You can't," he said gently, "but you can outgrow it." She blinked, surprised by the softness in his tone. "I want to. Tell me how." He looked at her thoughtfully. "We're launching a new program, Seeing Beyond Color. I want you to be part of it." Her eyes widened. "You want me to teach people about bias?" "After what I did, who better," he said. "People don't learn from saints. They learn from those who've stumbled and stood back up." Rebecca stared at him, tears welling. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that." "You will be," he said. "Growth starts with discomfort." When she left the office, the air felt lighter somehow. Clara entered a few minutes later, eyes questioning. "You're really giving her that responsibility?" "Yes," he replied. "If she redeems herself, it'll teach everyone more than punishment ever could." Clara studied him. You're gambling your reputation on compassion. David smiled faintly. Then it's the only gamble worth taking. By evening, news outlets were running with the headline, Orion Air CEO meets flight attendant at center of viral video refuses to fire her. Opinions exploded again. Some praised his grace, others called it weakness. But within the noise, something shifted. People began debating redemption, not revenge. Maya watched it all unfold from home. She read the comments out loud to her father. This is what leadership looks like. He's turning a scandal into a movement. She smiled for the first time in days. They're starting to see. David looked up from his laptop, where the outline of his new training initiative filled the screen. That's good, he said softly. Now we make sure they keep seeing. Outside, the night sky hung still, dotted with blinking aircraft lights. Somewhere up there, another Orion Air flight sliced through the clouds, carrying people who would never know the story behind the calm voice that guided their airline. But they would feel its echo in the way a flight attendant smiled, in the way service felt warmer, in the way silence began to heal instead of harm. The week that followed unfolded like a test of endurance. Outside Orion Air headquarters, news vans lined the street, their antennas jutting toward the sky as if desperate to catch every breath of the story. Inside, employees moved with quiet unease, whispering about the CEO who had become both hero and controversy. David Carter, however, moved through it all as if he were walking through calm water. His pace never changed. His tone never wavered. But behind that composure, something churned a storm of questions about how to heal a wound that was larger than one flight or one employee. In his office, the city stretched endlessly beneath him. But David's focus was on a single folder on his desk, the first draft of the Seeing Beyond Color program. The document outlined workshops, empathy training, and new hiring policies designed to eliminate unconscious bias. It was ambitious, maybe even idealistic, but he believed in it with the same quiet certainty that had carried him from the engineering floor to the top of the company. Still, he knew that belief alone wouldn't save Orion Air from the scrutiny pressing in from every direction. A knock on his door broke the silence. Clara Nguyen entered, her usually composed face showing the first signs of fatigue. "The board wants an update," she said. "Some of them are worried this program is too philosophical. They want something concrete, something measurable." David leaned back in his chair. Numbers are easy to measure. Humanity isn't. That's what they're missing. Clara exhaled. "I know, but they're afraid the public might see compassion as weakness. Then they've forgotten what leadership is," he replied. "We're not here to survive the headlines. We're here to build a company worth believing in." Before Clara could respond, his phone buzzed. It was Maya. Her message was short. "Dad, are you watching the news?" He switched on the small television in his office. The screen filled with the image of Rebecca Sloan standing outside her apartment building, surrounded by microphones. Her voice was shaky but clear. "I made a terrible mistake," she said, "and I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to do better." Reporters shouted questions. Someone asked if she blamed the company. She shook her head. "No, Mr. Carter gave me a chance I didn't deserve." If people see anything in this story, I hope they see that grace is harder and braver than anger. Clara turned to David. "You didn't ask her to do that, did you?" He shook his head slowly. "No, that's her first step on her own." For the first time in days, a faint smile touched his face. Later that afternoon, Rebecca arrived at headquarters for her first meeting with the cultural review team. The air in the training room was thick with tension. Some staff looked at her with sympathy, others with silent judgment. She felt every glance, every whisper, but she didn't run from it this time. David entered the room quietly, observing the group as they settled. "Before we start," he said, "I want everyone here to understand something. Change doesn't come from pretending we're perfect. It comes from admitting when we're not." His eyes met Rebecca's for a brief moment, steady, unblinking, forgiving. Then he turned back to the group. "We're not here to lecture. We're here to listen. I want you to talk about the things we ignore, the things we excuse, the things we tell ourselves aren't a problem because they're polite." A young attendant raised her hand. "Sir, can I be honest?" "Please," David said. "Sometimes," she began carefully, "we do judge people based on appearances. Not out of hate, more out of assumption. It's how we're trained to read passengers quickly, to guess what they need. But maybe in trying to be efficient, we stop being kind." David nodded. "Efficiency without empathy is indifference. That's what we need to unlearn." Rebecca listened, her chest tightening. Every word struck her like a reflection she didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. After the meeting, she lingered by the window, watching a plane take off. David approached quietly. "You handled that well," he said. She shook her head. "I'm just trying not to make it worse." He smiled faintly. "That's where every good change starts." She turned to him, eyes full of uncertainty. "Do you really believe people can change that much?" "I don't just believe it," he said. "I've seen it, and I plan to keep seeing it until it becomes normal." That evening, Rebecca walked home through the city streets, her thoughts heavy but not hopeless. The air was cool, the sky bruised with the first hint of rain. She stopped by a small bookstore near her apartment, a place she hadn't visited in years. Inside, the owner, an older black woman named Ruth Ellis, greeted her warmly. "It's been a long time. Honey, you look like you've seen a ghost." Rebecca gave a small, tired laugh. "Something like that." Ruth studied her face. "You're the flight attendant everyone's talking about, aren't you?" Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, that's me." Ruth poured 2 cups of tea and slid one across the counter. "People love to watch others fall, but they also love a story of redemption. The trick is, you can't fake it. You gotta live it." Rebecca stared into her cup. "I'm trying." "Good," Ruth said. "Then stop trying to prove you're sorry. Start proving you've changed." When Rebecca left, the rain had begun to fall in light, forgiving drops. The next morning, David arrived early again, long before most employees. He liked the quiet hours before the day began, when the office belonged only to thought. He stood by the window, phone in hand, reading a message from Ethan Brooks. The journalist had sent him a draft of a new article, From Prejudice to Progress: How a CEO Turned Scandal into Change. David scrolled through the paragraphs, factual, fair, balanced. Ethan had managed to capture the story without sensationalism. At the end, a single line stood out. Perhaps the real flight didn't happen at 30,000 feet, but in how people learn to rise above themselves. David smiled. He typed a brief reply. "Thank you for writing what matters." Moments later, Clara entered with the morning briefing. The board read the draft of the program. She said, "Some are finally starting to see the potential. They think it might set a new industry standard." David turned from the window, the sunlight catching the faint silver in his hair. "It's not about setting a standard," he said. It's about setting things right. Clara hesitated. You've carried this with so much grace. But are you all right? He looked at her, the calm returning to his eyes. When I was a boy, my mother used to say, dignity isn't something people give you. It's something you decide not to lose. That's what keeps me steady. Downstairs, employees began arriving. Rebecca joined them, no longer hiding, her presence quiet but stronger. As she stepped into the elevator, several colleagues greeted her with small nods, not all friendly, but all acknowledging. Progress, she realized, didn't roar. It whispered, at the end of the day. David met Maya for dinner in a small Harlem restaurant they both loved. She hugged him tightly before they sat. I saw Rebecca's interview. She said, she looked different, softer, maybe even brave. David smiled. Everyone deserves a chance to grow, even those who hurt us. Maya looked at him across the table, admiration glowing behind her eyes. You always find the calm in chaos, don't you? He chuckled. Only because chaos makes people listen. Outside, the city buzzed, neon lights reflecting in rain puddles. Somewhere above, an Orion airjet roared through the night sky. Inside the restaurant, father and daughter sat in easy silence, the kind that carried more peace than 1,000 apologies. For the first time since the flight, Maya felt the weight lift. The world hadn't changed overnight, but something had begun to shift, like the first turn of dawn after a long storm. A cold wind swept through Manhattan the morning David Carter was scheduled to address the entire Orion Air staff for the first time since the scandal began. The auditorium buzzed with subdued anticipation flight attendants in Navy uniforms, mechanics in oil-stained overalls, executives in crisp suits all gathered under the same roof, waiting for the man who had quietly become a symbol of calm defiance. Rebecca Sloan sat in the middle row, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the soft murmur around her. She wasn't supposed to be here originally, but David had insisted. This story involves all of us, he had said, and she knew exactly what he meant. Maya Carter sat near the front, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. Though only 17, she had learned more about the world's quiet injustices in the past few weeks than any classroom could teach. She wanted to see what her father would say to the company, to the people who doubted him, to the ones who quietly supported him. When David finally stepped onto the stage, the room fell completely silent. He didn't stand behind the podium. Instead, he walked to the front edge, hands clasped loosely, voice measured and warm. I've been asked a lot these past few days, he began. Why I didn't fire anyone. Why I didn't fight back publicly. Why I stayed silent when the world was shouting. He looked across the sea of faces, some sympathetic, others skeptical, many simply curious. The answer is simple. Because when we shout, we stop listening. And when we stop listening, we stop learning. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. I founded Orion Air with a simple belief. He continued, that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, whether they're sitting in first class or in the last row. But dignity isn't a rule. It's a habit, a choice we make every day. And somewhere along the way, we stopped making that choice consistently. He paused, letting the words sink in. So today isn't about blame. It's about building something better. Starting now, Orion Air will implement the Seeing Beyond Color initiative across all departments. It's not just a training, it's a transformation. Claire Nguyen stepped up beside him and displayed a digital presentation. Images of workshops, team sessions, and revised service standards filled the screen. This program was designed in collaboration with experts, but guided by something more powerful than data-human experience, she explained. David nodded and turned toward the audience again. And I want to thank the person who had the courage to face their mistake and help us shape this program, Rebecca Sloan. Every eye in the room turned toward her. She froze, the world narrowing into the sound of her heartbeat. Then, slowly, she rose from her seat. David gestured for her to join him on stage. The applause started hesitantly, then grew stronger as she made her way forward. Rebecca's throat felt dry. She hadn't planned on speaking, but when she reached the microphone, she found her voice waiting for her. When I looked at Mr. Carter and his daughter that day, she began, I saw two people I didn't understand, and because of that, I made assumptions. I thought professionalism meant being polite, but I learned that politeness without respect is just a mask. I can't undo what I did, but I can help make sure it doesn't happen again. Her voice wavered, but she steadied herself. I've spent the last weeks looking in a mirror I used to avoid. What I saw wasn't pretty, but I realized that guilt doesn't have to be a prison. It can be a teacher. The audience was utterly silent. Even the skeptical executives listened. David stepped forward again. Admiring Rebecca's courage doesn't erase what happened, but it turns it into something meaningful. And that's what this company must do, turn discomfort into understanding, mistakes into growth. After the meeting ended, people approached Rebecca, some offering quiet support, others thanking her. A few still looked away, but that no longer crushed her. Change wasn't about convincing everyone. It was about staying true to the new path. Later that day, Maya waited for her father outside his office. When he emerged, she smiled. You made them listen, she said softly. He chuckled. For now. She tilted her head. Do you think they'll really change? He looked out toward the skyline. Change isn't a moment. Maya, it's a process. But today, we took the first step. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan Brooks sat in a coffee shop, laptop open, watching the live broadcast replay. He couldn't help but smile. The tone of the story had shifted, less outrage, more reflection. His next article would capture that evolution. The headline forming in his mind was simple yet profound. Grace at 30,000 feet. How one act of restraint redefined an airline. That evening, Rebecca visited Ruth Ellis's bookstore again. The bell over the door jingled softly. Ruth looked up from her counter, her face breaking into a knowing smile. Well, look at you, standing taller already. Rebecca laughed lightly. I'm still shaking inside. Ruth poured her tea as always. Good. It means you care. People who don't shake usually don't change. They sat together in comfortable quiet for a moment before Rebecca asked, Do you think people will ever stop judging me for that one mistake? Ruth smiled gently. Honey, some people hold on to other folks' mistakes because it's easier than facing their own. But you keep walking forward. The only way to outgrow your past is to live differently in the present. Rebecca nodded slowly, feeling the truth of it settle deep within her. At the same time, in another corner of the city, David sat in a dimly lit diner with Claire and Janet Rivers, reviewing progress reports. The waitress filled their coffee cups, and the smell of fried eggs filled the air. It wasn't a glamorous meeting, but David liked that. Change, he thought, wasn't born in boardrooms. It started in places like this, among ordinary people trying to do better. Janet looked up from her notes. You know, Public sentiment is turning. People are calling you the calm CEO. The story's becoming an example in leadership seminars. David smiled faintly. Let's hope they remember the message, not the man. Clara glanced at him. What message exactly? That integrity isn't loud, he said. It's steady. The following week, Orion Air launched its first pilot session of the Seeing Beyond Color program. David chose to attend quietly, sitting in the back while a facilitator led a discussion about bias and perception. Rebecca co-led the session, sharing her experience with raw honesty, when a young flight attendant nervously admitted, "I think sometimes I do what you did, I just didn't realize it." Rebecca smiled gently. Then you're already ahead of where I was. Awareness is the first flight toward change. Afterward, David approached her. You did well today, he said. She smiled faintly. I still feel like I'm learning how to breathe again. That's what transformation feels like, he said. As she walked away, Rebecca realized something powerful. She no longer felt like the villain of the story. She was becoming part of its redemption. That night, as David drove home through quiet city streets, he reflected on the strange symmetry of it all. The same flight that once humiliated him had now become the catalyst for hope. His phone buzzed with a message from Maya, proud of you, Dad. He smiled to himself. He thought about his late wife, who had always told him, the higher you rise, the quieter you must be. Looking out at the city lights, he understood what she meant more than ever. True leadership wasn't about standing above others. It was about lifting them, even when they'd once pulled you down. And so, as another Orion airplane soared silently above the skyline, David whispered to himself, this is only the beginning. 3 weeks had passed since the company-wide meeting, and the ripples of change were finally visible across Orion Air. Crew members greeted passengers with genuine warmth instead of rehearsed smiles. Cabin announcements carried a softer tone, and even the way attendants walked down the aisles felt different, less mechanical, more human. It was as if the airline itself had begun to breathe again. David Carter watched this transformation with quiet pride, but also caution. He knew cultural change was fragile. It needed time, patience, and consistency. He was standing in the observation lounge at JFK Airport one crisp morning, watching the company's new promotional video play on the screen's diverse faces, real employees, and the new tagline, Flying Beyond Boundaries. Maya, standing beside him, smiled. That's beautiful, she said. You can feel it's different now. David nodded. Change has to be felt, not just seen. Words alone never moved anyone. She glanced up at him. So what's next? He hesitated, then said, I'm flying again tomorrow. On one of our long-haul routes, Flight 0801 to London. Rebecca's scheduled as senior attendant. Maya's eyebrows lifted. You're flying with her again? He smiled faintly. Yes, it's time for a full circle. The next day dawned silver gray, clouds hovering low over the airport, inside the aircraft. Rebecca moved carefully through pre-flight checks. Every sound, the click of the overhead bins, the low hum of the engines reminded her of that first flight, the one that had changed everything. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She was focused, deliberate, aware. Helena joined her by the galley, her voice warm. You okay? Rebecca nodded. More than okay. Just ready. When boarding began, David stepped through the gate with his carry-on in hand. The moment Rebecca saw him, something inside her stilled. She straightened instinctively, but smiled genuinely this time. Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter. He returned her smile. Thank you, Ms. Sloan. It's good to see you again." The other passengers filed in: business travelers, families, elderly couples, and a few children clutching stuffed animals. Among them was a young boy named Jordan Miller, about 8 years old, traveling alone. His tag read "unaccompanied minor." Rebecca knelt beside him. "Hey there, Jordan. I'm Rebecca. I'll be looking after you today." The boy smiled nervously. "My mom says flying's like magic." Rebecca chuckled softly. "She's right. You'll see it yourself soon enough." David watched the interaction quietly as he took his seat. It reminded him of Maya at that age, wide-eyed and fearless. He leaned back, feeling an unexpected calm settle over him. This flight, he realized, wasn't about business. It was about closure. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, Rebecca began the service routine. Her movements were smooth, confident, no longer weighed down by guilt. When she approached David's row, she met his gaze without hesitation. "Coffee or tea?" "Sir, coffee." "Thank you," he said. Then, after a pause, "You're excellent at what you do." Her lips curved into a small smile. "I had a very patient teacher," she replied. As the flight continued, turbulence hit unexpectedly. The cabin lights flickered briefly, and a few passengers gasped. Rebecca moved quickly, steadying herself against the cart. She reassured everyone with calm professionalism, checking seat belts, soothing a crying toddler. When she reached young Jordan, the boy's hands were gripping the armrest tightly. Rebecca knelt beside him. "Hey, remember what your mom said flying's magic? The plane's just dancing with the wind right now." Jordan looked at her uncertainly. "It's kind of scary." She smiled. "All good magic feels that way at first. You're safe." David watched her from across the aisle, admiration quietly blooming in his chest. He had seen people crumble under public shame, but Rebecca had rebuilt herself through service patiently, without spectacle. He took a sip of coffee, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him for weeks. As the turbulence subsided, Rebecca returned to the galley. Elna approached, whispering, "You handled that perfectly." Rebecca exhaled, relief softening her shoulders. "I finally feel like I belong up here again." Later, as passengers settled into sleep and the cabin lights dimmed, David walked to the galley. Rebecca looked up in surprise. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said quietly. "Not at all," she replied. "Can I get you anything?" "Just a moment of honesty," he said. She tilted her head, unsure what he meant. "Do you forgive yourself?" he asked gently. Her breath caught. I think I'm learning to." He nodded. "That's all anyone can do." They stood in silence for a few moments, listening to the low hum of the engines. Finally, Rebecca spoke again. "You know, after everything, I kept wondering why you didn't get angry that day. It would have been easier to just call me out." David's eyes softened. "Maybe, but easy rarely teaches." She looked at him for a long moment, her throat tight. "Thank you for not giving up on me." He smiled faintly. "Thank yourself. You chose to rise." By the time the plane began its descent into London, dawn had painted the horizon in pale gold. The passengers stirred, stretching and whispering as the cabin came back to life. Rebecca made her final checks, then paused at David's seat one last time. "Thank you for flying with us, Mr. Carter," she said. "It was a good flight," he replied, "in more ways than one." When the plane landed and passengers disembarked, Jordan lingered near Rebecca, clutching his backpack. "You were right," he said with a grin. "Flying is magic." She smiled warmly. "So is kindness." Jordan, remember that." As David walked down the jet bridge, the cool London air brushed his face. He stopped briefly to glance back at the aircraft, his company, his people, his mission. For the first time since the scandal, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel fully: pride. Not for what they'd achieved yet, but for what they were becoming. Outside the terminal, Ethan Brooks was waiting, his camera slung over his shoulder. "Mr. Carter," he greeted. "Mind if I get a few words for the follow-up piece?" David smiled. "As long as it's about the people, not me." Ethan chuckled. "Always." They spoke briefly, Ethan's questions thoughtful rather than probing. "So, what's next for Orion Air?" he asked. David looked out toward the runway, where another plane was taking off. "Next," he said softly, "we keep flying higher together." Later that evening, after interviews and meetings, David walked along the Thames. The city lights shimmered across the water like distant constellations. He thought of Maya, Rebecca, Clara, Elena, Ethan, all the people who had been part of this quiet revolution. Each of them, in their own way, had carried the weight of change. He paused, watching a plane glide overhead, its lights blinking faintly against the dark sky. Somewhere up there, countless lives were crossing paths, each carrying their own stories, their own lessons, their own chances for redemption. And in that moment, David Carter smiled not as a CEO, not as a man who had endured judgment, but as someone who had learned the rarest truth of all sometimes. Forgiveness isn't the end of the journey, it's the beginning of flight. The London morning unfolded under a thin veil of mist. The air smelled faintly of rain and roasted coffee drifting from the airport cafes. David Carter adjusted his tie as he stepped into the glass-walled conference center, the subtle hum of reporters and executives echoing across the atrium. Orion Air was hosting its first International Leadership Forum, an event planned long before the scandal, but now it carried an entirely different weight. Inside the hall, Clara Nguyen moved briskly between rows of chairs, coordinating last-minute details. She spotted David and hurried over. "Good morning, sir. Everything's ready. We have representatives from 32 airlines attending, plus media coverage from The Atlantic and The Guardian." David smiled, calm as always. "Let's make sure they hear more than speeches. Let them see sincerity." Clara nodded, her respect for him deepening with each passing day. His strength wasn't loud. It was quiet and relentless, like the steady hum of the engines that carried his company forward. Across the room, Rebecca Sloan stood near the back, adjusting her new badge training and culture lead. The title still felt foreign on her chest, but it carried meaning she had earned through fire. She caught sight of David speaking with a group of executives and smiled faintly. For the first time in months, she felt both seen and useful. As the conference began, lights dimmed, and the Orion logo appeared on the large screen behind the stage. David stepped up to the podium this time, his silhouette framed by soft blue light. "When I founded Orion Air," he began, "I believed that connecting people across the world was enough. But I've learned something important. Connection without understanding is fragile. It breaks under the smallest weight of ignorance." He paused, scanning the audience of leaders, journalists, and employees. "In the last few months, our company faced a test, not of profit, not of growth, but of conscience. We failed a passenger, not because of our systems, but because of our silence. And when that silence was exposed, we had a choice to protect our pride or to repair our soul." You could have heard a pin drop. Every face was turned toward him. We chose the harder path. David continued, we listened, we changed, we created Seeing Beyond Color. Not as an apology, but as a commitment to see the world and each other fully. The room erupted in applause, but David lifted a hand lightly. Thank you. But the applause belongs to those who made this change real. He gestured toward Rebecca. Ms. Rebecca Sloan, please join me. Rebecca froze for half a second, then rose slowly, her heels echoing against the marble floor as she made her way to the stage. Cameras flashed. She could feel the heat of attention burning her skin, but she kept her head high. David smiled as she reached him. Rebecca represents what true growth looks like: humility, courage, and the willingness to face oneself. She was part of the problem once, and now she's part of the solution. I couldn't be prouder. Rebecca took the microphone, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. I never expected to stand here again, not after what I did. But Mr. Carter taught me something. I'll never forget redemption doesn't erase your past. It rewrites your future. And if this program can help others see their blind spots before they hurt someone, then maybe my mistake was worth it. Applause swelled again, this time with emotion. Even a few of the most cynical executives rose to their feet. After the conference ended, Rebecca slipped away to the outdoor terrace for air. The Thames flowed quietly below, its gray waters glinting under the muted sunlight. She leaned on the railing, exhaling a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Beautiful speech. Came a familiar voice. She turned to see Ethan Brooks standing there, holding his notepad. I was covering the event for the Atlantic, he explained, smiling. Seems like you've gone from headline villain to hero. Rebecca shook her head. I'm no hero, just someone who stopped pretending to know everything. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. That's rarer than heroism. They both laughed softly. After a moment, Ethan added, You know, your story's going to help people. Not just here, everywhere. Rebecca glanced back toward the hall. I hope it helps people listen to themselves, to others. Maybe that's all it takes. Meanwhile, inside, Clara found David reviewing feedback forms. You did it again, she said with a small smile. You turned a PR crisis into a global dialogue. He chuckled. I didn't do it. People did. They just needed a reason to believe change could start from the inside. Just then, his phone buzzed. A message from Maya appeared. Proud of you. Dad. I watched the live stream. You were incredible. David smiled quietly, typing a reply. You're the reason I try to be. Later that evening, the Orion team gathered at a small London restaurant to celebrate the forum's success. Laughter filled the room, a sound that had been missing for too long. Rebecca sat between Claire and Elena, feeling genuinely part of something larger than herself. Across the table, David raised his glass. To progress, he said. To progress. They echoed. But beneath the joy, there was an undercurrent of exhaustion. Change, after all, came at a price. For weeks, David had worked day and night balancing corporate expectations, public appearances, and the emotional labor of rebuilding trust. As the others chatted, he excused himself quietly and stepped outside into the cool London night. The air carried the faint scent of rain and distant music from a nearby street performer. He stood there, letting the breeze cool the tension in his shoulders. His thoughts wandered to Maya, to his late wife, to the boy on the last flight, to Rebecca's courage. He was proud. Yet somewhere deep inside, a flicker of doubt remained. Could this transformation truly last, or would it fade when the headlines did? Clara joined him after a few minutes, her expression soft. "You look like a man who's thinking too much." He smiled faintly. "Thinking's a hard habit to break." "Then think about this," she said. "You built an airline that connects continents. Now you're building one that connects hearts. That's something no stock report can measure." He looked at her, gratitude warming his voice. "Thank you, Clara." "Any time," she said. Before heading back inside, David stayed outside a little longer, staring at the lights shimmering over the Thames. He knew challenges still waited ahead: corporate resistance, public scrutiny, the slow erosion of enthusiasm that often follows moral victories. But tonight, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, people could learn to fly differently. Rebecca left the restaurant later, walking through the quiet streets toward her hotel. Her phone buzzed with a new email notification. She opened it and froze. It was from a young flight attendant she had never met, named Lena Ortiz. The subject line read, "Thank you." The message was simple. "I saw your story. I used to judge passengers, too. Now I see faces, not assumptions. You helped me change before I made the same mistake." Tears blurred Rebecca's vision. She stopped under a street lamp, rereading the message again and again. For the first time, her mistake felt lighter, not erased, but transformed. When she reached her room, she stood by the window, watching a distant plane take off into the night sky. Its lights blinked faintly against the dark, like tiny reminders that even after the darkest moments, something or someone always finds a way to rise. The morning after the London Forum, the city awoke beneath soft drizzle, the kind that made streets glisten and slowed the world just enough for reflection. David Carter sat by the hotel window, nursing a cup of black coffee as the distant rumble of planes drifted through the air. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to sit in stillness. No meetings, no interviews, just quiet. The success of the forum had rippled across the aviation industry overnight. News outlets called Orion Air a model of corporate humility. Some headlines praised David as a visionary leader who turned conflict into culture, while others questioned whether compassion could truly sustain a global business. David read none of them. He had learned that noise, whether praise or criticism, distracted from purpose. He looked at his phone. A message from Maya lit up the screen. "When are you coming home? I miss you." He smiled softly and typed back, "Soon, sweetheart. Just one more meeting." Downstairs, Claire Nguyen was already waiting in the lobby, her posture as composed as ever. When David joined her, she handed him a folder. "I think you'll want to see this," she said. "Our post-forum analytics are beyond expectations. But more interestingly, we've received partnership requests from 2 international carriers who want to implement the Seeing Beyond Color initiative." David flipped through the pages. "That's progress," he said quietly, "and responsibility." Clara smiled. "You sound like a man who's both relieved and exhausted." He chuckled. "That's because I am." As they headed to the car, flashes from photographers caught them off guard. A small crowd had gathered outside the hotel. David didn't flinch. He'd grown used to the attention, but it still unsettled him the way people turned transformation into spectacle. As they drove off, he stared out the window, watching London fade into gray. "Change," he murmured, "should never become entertainment." Back at Orion Air's London branch office, Rebecca Sloan was finishing a workshop with the newest group of trainees. The classroom buzzed with energy young flight attendants discussing empathy, communication, and inclusivity. Rebecca walked among them, listening. One of the trainees, Lena Ortiz, raised her hand. "Ms. Sloan, can I ask something personal?" "Of course," Rebecca replied. "When you made your mistake, did you ever think your career was over?" Rebecca paused, remembering the sting of shame, the silence on that flight, the weight of judgment. "Yes," she said softly. "But sometimes, endings are just invitations to start again. You don't control how others see you, but you can control how you grow from it." Lena nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. "That's what I'm hoping to do, too." When the class ended, Rebecca lingered in the empty room. Her reflection caught faintly in the glass window. For the first time, she didn't see the person she used to be. She saw someone in motion, still imperfect, but moving forward. Later that afternoon, Clara called her. "David wants to see you before we fly back to New York," she said. "He's in the executive lounge." Rebecca's pulse quickened. She had seen him on stage, in meetings, even on flights, but each time felt different, like she was meeting a new version of him. When she entered the lounge, David was standing by the large windows overlooking the runway. "Miss Sloan," he greeted, his tone warm. "Congratulations on the workshop results. Clara tells me you've become quite the teacher." Rebecca smiled shyly. "I just try to pass on what I've learned." He nodded, still gazing at the horizon. "Funny thing about teaching," he said. "You start by thinking it's about helping others, but it ends up helping you too." They stood in silence for a moment, watching a plane lift into the sky, its engines roaring softly through the glass. Rebecca finally spoke. "You know, I used to think strength meant control, that keeping emotions hidden was professionalism. But now I think it's the opposite. Real strength is being able to see your flaws and still show up." David turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "That's the kind of strength that builds legacies." She hesitated. "Do you ever wonder if people will move on from this story? Forget it ever happened?" He smiled faintly. "I hope they don't. Some stories need to stay alive, not as reminders of failure, but as proof of change." Just then, Clara entered, carrying her tablet. "Sorry to interrupt," she said. "We just received an invitation from the United Nations Council for Ethical Business. They want you, David, to speak at their summit next month." David raised an eyebrow. "The UN." Clara nodded. "They called your initiative a blueprint for moral leadership." He chuckled softly. "A high praise for an airline." Rebecca grinned. "Or maybe a well-deserved one." After Clara left, Rebecca said quietly, "You must be proud." David looked out at the planes again. "Pride's a tricky thing," he said. "It can blind you just as easily as shame. I try to stay somewhere in the middle, grateful, but grounded." Their flight to New York was scheduled for that evening. As dusk settled, the sky turned amber and gray, and a light drizzle began to fall again. On board, the cabin glowed with soft light. Passengers settled in, unaware that the man in seat 2A was the CEO whose quiet revolution had changed the face of air travel. Rebecca passed through the cabin, her tone calm and confident as she checked seat belts and greeted travelers. When she reached David, she smiled. "Back home again." He nodded. "Home is wherever we learn something new." The plane ascended smoothly, cutting through the clouds like a silver arrow. David gazed out the window, the horizon glowing faintly with the promise of sunrise across the Atlantic. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the engines wash over him. Hours later, turbulence shook the cabin. Rebecca's voice came over the intercom, composed as ever. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We're experiencing a brief patch of rough air. David opened his eyes, calm but alert. Across the aisle, a nervous passenger gripped the armrest, his knuckles white. Rebecca approached, crouching beside him. "It's all right," she said softly. "The air just likes to remind us it's alive." The man laughed shakily, and David smiled to himself. The words echoed his own from that first flight, the one where everything had started. When the plane finally landed at JFK, the applause that filled the cabin was spontaneous. Passengers smiled at each other, relieved and grateful. David stood, collecting his things. Rebecca met him by the door, as she had once before. But this time, her smile reached her eyes. "Thank you for flying with us," she said warmly. David paused, meeting her gaze. "No," he said quietly. "Thank you for helping us learn how to fly differently." As he stepped off the plane, the cool night air of New York wrapped around him. Somewhere in the distance, the skyline shimmered like a promise. He knew the journey wasn't over. The true test of change wasn't applause or headlines. It was what happened when no one was watching. He walked toward the terminal exit, his reflection catching briefly in the glass, calm, resolute, human. For all his titles and accomplishments, David Carter knew one truth clearer than ever. The real measure of leadership wasn't how high he could fly, but how deeply he could see. The first rays of dawn filtered through the towering windows of Orion Air Headquarters, casting gold across the marble floors. The building, once a symbol of luxury and ambition, now carried something deeper in its air, an energy of renewal. The story that had started with a single act of quiet prejudice had grown into a movement reshaping not only a company, but an entire industry. David Carter stood by his office window, sipping his coffee, watching one of his aircraft glide into the sky. His reflection on the glass looked older somehow, though not weaker, more seasoned, more certain of what mattered. The weight of leadership no longer felt like a burden, but a calling. His phone buzzed on the desk. A message from the United Nations confirmed his keynote slot at the Ethical Business Summit in Geneva. Clara Nguyen had already arranged everything: his travel, the press briefing, even the dinner with key international delegates. Yet David's mind wasn't on logistics. It was on the meaning of it all. He turned as Clara entered the office, her usual poise softened by quiet pride. "The final agenda for Geneva is ready," she said, placing a folder on his desk. "And I took the liberty of including Rebecca as part of the team delegation. Her section on empathy training has been requested by 2 other airlines." David smiled. "That's good. She's earned that spotlight." Clara hesitated. "You've built something extraordinary here, David. But I can tell this journey has taken a lot out of you." He looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. "Change always does, but it gives something back, too. Perspective, purpose, maybe even peace." Later that afternoon, the team gathered for a small pre-departure meeting. Rebecca arrived early, as she always did, carrying a folder of notes and a calm confidence that had replaced the nervous energy she once wore like armor. When she saw David, she smiled. "Claire told me about Geneva. I just want to say thank you for believing in me long before I believed in myself." He shook his head. "You did the work. I just gave you the runway." Rebecca chuckled softly. "Still, it means more than you know." As the meeting began, Clara reviewed their presentation plan. Janet Rivers briefed them on media questions, and Rebecca shared stories from recent workshops. But when she spoke about empathy, the room quieted. "Empathy isn't a policy," she said, her voice gentle but steady. It's a practice. It starts when we stop seeing people as passengers, employees, or numbers, and start seeing them as stories. Every seat, every name tag, every face has a story, and our job is to honor it. David listened, his chest tightening with pride. He had once believed that leadership meant control, structure, results. Now, he understood that real leadership meant creating space for others to rise. The next morning, they departed for Geneva. The private flight felt almost symbolic, an airborne classroom of everything they had learned. Rebecca sat by the window, notebook in hand, while Clara reviewed talking points with calm precision. David closed his eyes briefly, listening to the steady hum of the engines. Halfway across the Atlantic, turbulence rattled the cabin. Rebecca instinctively rose from her seat to assist, steadying a loose tray and calming Clara, who had gripped her armrest. When the shaking subsided, Rebecca laughed softly. "Seems like the sky's testing us again." David opened his eyes, smiling. "The sky never tests us. It just reminds us we're small, and that's a good thing." Hours later, they landed in Geneva to crisp mountain air and quiet streets lined with flags. The summit was hosted in a glass dome overlooking Lake Geneva, where leaders from around the world gathered to discuss ethics and commerce. David's speech was scheduled for the final day, but whispers of his presence filled the corridors before he even arrived. Some saw him as a reformer, others still doubted his idealism, but everyone listened when his name was mentioned. The evening before the summit, David walked along the lakeside path, the water reflecting the city lights. Rebecca joined him, hands tucked into her coat pockets. "Beautiful place," she said softly. "Peaceful." He nodded. "You can see further when the water's calm." They walked in silence for a while before Rebecca spoke again. "You know, I still think about that flight sometimes. How something so small could have stayed unnoticed forever if not for you." David smiled faintly. "It wasn't me. It was the world deciding it was ready to notice." She stopped, looking at him. "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened? That we could have learned these lessons another way?" He thought for a long moment. Every storm teaches something calm never can. Sometimes pain is the only teacher that stays. Rebecca nodded slowly, the reflection of streetlights shimmering in her eyes. "I guess that's true. Still, I wish I'd seen it sooner." He turned to her gently. "You did see it just later, and sometimes later is right on time." The next day, the summit hall was filled to capacity. Delegates, CEOs, scholars, and activists gathered as David took the stage. His presence commanded attention, not through grandeur, but through grace. The lights dimmed, and a hush settled. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice deep and measured. "Months ago, one of my flights made international news not for innovation or achievement, but for a failure of perception. What happened that day wasn't unique. It happens every day, in every industry, in every place where someone is judged before they're known." He paused, scanning the audience, but what followed that was rare. We faced our failure, not by hiding it, but by learning from it. We turned embarrassment into education. And what we discovered is this progress begins the moment empathy becomes policy, not poetry. Applause filled the room, not the polite kind, but the genuine kind that carries emotion. David continued, "A true equality doesn't happen when systems change. It happens when hearts do. Every business in this room has the power to build not just profits, but purpose." When he finished, the audience rose to its feet. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and somewhere in the crowd, Rebecca felt tears fill her eyes. She wasn't crying from guilt this time, but from gratitude. After the speech, delegates surrounded David, asking questions, offering praise. But amid the noise, he caught sight of Rebecca standing quietly at the edge of the stage. He made his way through the crowd and said softly, "We did it." She smiled. "You did it." He shook his head. "No. Rebecca, we did. That night, the Orient team celebrated at a small lakeside restaurant." Laughter mingled with clinking glasses and the faint sound of piano music. Clara made a toast to resilience. Janet raised hers to truth. Rebecca, shyly, raised hers to forgiveness. When it was David's turn, he said simply, "To seeing one another fully." After dinner, as the group dispersed into the Geneva night, David walked alone along the quiet water once more. The air smelled faintly of pine and rain. His phone buzzed with another message from Maya. Saw the speech online. "You made me cry again. Love you. Dad." He smiled, typing back. "Then I did something right." He looked out at the still lake, the mountains standing tall in the distance. The world felt vast, yet tender, like a truth he'd always known, but had only just begun to understand, that sometimes the greatest journeys aren't measured in miles, but in how deeply they change the people who take them. The morning after the Geneva summit dawned crisp and silver, the kind of morning that seemed to hum with quiet completion. A faint mist curled over Lake Geneva, blurring the line between water and sky. Inside his hotel suite, David Carter stood by the balcony, dressed in a simple navy suit, his luggage waiting by the door. The applause from yesterday's speech still echoed faintly in his mind, not as vanity, but as reassurance proof that what had once been a single painful incident had grown into a movement rooted in truth. He checked his phone. Dozens of notifications buzzed in, messages from journalists, CEOs, and even ordinary passengers thanking him for speaking. But one message stopped him, an email from a teacher in Atlanta. "My students watched your story. We had a discussion about empathy today. They said they want to create a Seeing Beyond Color project for their school. Thank you for showing them that kindness can be taught." David stared at the screen for a long moment, a quiet smile spreading across his face. Change, he thought, always starts small. One flight, one heart, one conversation at a time. Downstairs in the lobby, Rebecca Sloan was waiting with Clara Nguyen and Janet Rivers. They were heading to the airport for their flight home. Rebecca looked radiant, not in the glamorous sense, but in the grounded way of someone at peace with who she was. Her eyes carried the calm of someone who had walked through judgment and come out on the other side, lighter. As David approached, she said softly, "You know, I think I finally understand what you meant when you said silence teaches nothing. I used to hide behind quiet, hoping time would erase what I did. But real healing started only when I started speaking." David smiled. "And now you're teaching others to do the same." They boarded the Orion air flight back to New York, greeted by a new generation of attendants, faces full of hope, accents and skin tones reflecting every corner of the world. Rebecca noticed one of them, a young man named Tobias Reed, struggling nervously with the service cart. She walked over and offered a reassuring nod. "Don't rush," she said gently. "Passengers don't remember if you're perfect. They remember if you're kind." He nodded, grateful, and she saw in him a reflection of her younger self, the same hunger to belong, the same fear of failing. The flight was smooth, serene even. David sat by the window, notebook open, jotting thoughts for his next address. But as he wrote, his mind wandered not to future conferences or accolades, but to the small, quiet moments that had defined this journey. Maya's laughter, Rebecca's trembling apology, Clara's steady confidence, the boy on the plane clutching his stuffed bear. He realized that every face had been a compass, pointing him closer to what leadership truly meant. A few hours into the flight, Claire approached. "David," she said softly, "I've been thinking, maybe we should expand, seeing beyond color, into a foundation, one that works beyond aviation, schools, hospitals, public service training." David looked up, eyes thoughtful. "You mean take it global?" She nodded. "You've already proven empathy can be taught. Why stop at our own walls?" He smiled. "Then let's make it official. But it shouldn't carry my name. It should belong to everyone who believes in what it stands for." Rebecca, overhearing from a few seats away, added gently, "Call it the Carter Initiative. You may not want your name on it, but it started with you." He hesitated, then laughed softly. "All right, but only if you promise to lead the first chapter." Her eyes widened. "You've lived it," he said simply. "No one can teach it better." The flight attendants passed by, refilling cups of coffee. The cabin lights dimmed as the aircraft crossed the Atlantic twilight. Rebecca stared out the window for a long time, watching the faint curve of the earth below. It struck her how something as massive as the world could look so peaceful from up here, how distance softened even the harshest divisions. When the plane landed at JFK, the Orion team was greeted by a small group of reporters waiting by the gate. They wanted reactions from Geneva, quotes, sound bites, but David politely declined most questions, saying only, "The story isn't mine anymore. It belongs to everyone who's decided to see a little clearer." As they exited the terminal, Maya was waiting, her smile bright and wide. She ran to her father, hugging him tightly. "You did it," she whispered. He kissed the top of her head. "We did it," he replied, glancing toward Rebecca and Clara. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, media interviews, and congratulations. Yet amid the noise, David kept his focus where it belonged, on people. He visited an Orion training center unannounced, sitting quietly in the back as Rebecca taught her first new class under the Carter Initiative. He watched as she guided trainees through scenarios of empathy, cultural understanding, and dignity. Her voice was steady, her tone compassionate. He noticed how she listened more than she spoke. During a break, Rebecca spotted him and walked over. Surprised. "You're really here? I wouldn't miss it," he said. "You're doing remarkable work." She smiled. "I still get nervous." "Good," he replied. "It means you care." That evening, David returned to his office, alone. The city stretched beneath him, lights flickering like constellations. On his desk sat a framed photograph, a candid shot from the Geneva summit, showing the Orion team laughing by the lake. He picked it up, tracing the edges thoughtfully. He remembered his wife's words years ago, spoken long before success or scandal. "The higher you rise, the softer you must walk." Back then, he hadn't understood. Now, it was clear grace wasn't weakness. It was mastery over ego. He opened the window slightly. The hum of traffic below mingled with the distant sound of a plane ascending into the night. He thought of all the lives now touched by that simple message. See before you judge. Listen before you speak. Care before you command. A soft knock sounded at the door. Clara peeked in. "You're still here?" He smiled, just saying goodbye to what he looked out at the skyline, to the noise. "From tomorrow, it's about legacy." Clara nodded, sensing the quiet finality in his tone. "Then let's make it count." The next morning, news broke that Orion Air had launched the Carter Initiative for global empathy and inclusion. Partnerships poured in schools, nonprofits, governments, airlines that once competed now collaborated. The story that began with humiliation had become a blueprint for healing. Months later, Rebecca visited a small public school in Chicago, standing before a classroom of children. She shared her story not as an ex-flight attendant or corporate trainer, but as a human being. The children listened with wide eyes as she said, "Everyone makes mistakes, but what matters most is who you become after them." In the back of the room hung a poster with the initiative's slogan, "The sky belongs to everyone." Meanwhile, David stood on an observation deck at JFK Airport, watching an Orion Airjet take off into the golden morning light. Maya stood beside him, holding his hand. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "Yes, because now it finally means something." He watched the plane climb higher, slicing through the clouds, a silver silhouette against the vast blue sky. And in that quiet moment, he understood that his journey was no longer about redemption or reputation. It was about humanity, about creating a world where every person, no matter where they came from or how they looked, had a seat in the sky. The hum of the engines faded into the distance. The world kept moving. But for David Carter, everything, every struggle, every lesson, every act of grace had led here, to peace, to purpose, to flight. The story of David Carter reminds us that dignity is not given, it's chosen. In a world where judgment often comes before understanding, his calmness teaches us the strength of restraint. Real power isn't found in shouting back, but in holding your ground with grace. For older generations, who've lived through times of change and struggle, this story echoes a truth we already know deep inside, that respect can't be demanded through anger. It's earned through example. Rebecca's journey, from shame to redemption, reminds us that it's never too late to grow. We all make mistakes. What defines us is what we do after them. Her transformation shows that forgiveness, both giving and receiving, can heal wounds deeper than words. In life, we will always face moments where others fail to see our worth. But if we respond with patience, humility, and integrity, we don't just change one person, we change the world, one small act at a time. Thank you for watching and sharing this journey with us. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Every click helps us bring more powerful human stories to life stories that remind us all that kindness still matters, and that we all have the power to make the world a little better. One act of understanding at a time.